You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property and their laws. They had no part in making it.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 512 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. Returning to the show today is John Dangelo. He is the anti-war war vet and was on the show last week talking about his experience from, being a Marine reservist to, now writing articles at Anti-War and the Libertarian Institute. So make sure to check out his website, his Facebook page, both Anti-War War Vet, and then, keep an eye out, at Anti-War and Libertarian Institute. Occasionally he'll write an article and it'll be up there. John, really, I've had you on the show to talk about a couple of things now, mainly, I guess, your two careers, one being a soldier and the other one being a medical professional. And so we're going to cycle back around to the medical professional side of it first today. And a big story that's in the news is the killing of Elijah McClain. He actually died last August on the streets of Aurora, Colorado, after, he was given a chokehold by a police officer and then a ketamine known as ketamine by the EMT. And so, there's a lot of medical stuff going on here. And since you're an ER nurse and have experience as an EMT, I thought you'd be the guy to interview on this. So welcome back to the show. How you doing today?
I'm doing good, man. How are you?
Doing well. And, this is, I think, a very important topic because it's something that obviously doesn't really get a lot of coverage, but it apparently happens a few hundred or 1,000 times a year. I've been going back and doing some research, and I'm finding different news sources will say, in Florida, we had 500 of these instances where EMTs will respond and in coordination with police give ketamine to somebody, and then in rare cases there's serious consequences, and in Colorado in particular, Elijah McClain passes away. So I guess first off, just what is ketamine? Really the only experience I've had with this drug is from I actually worked in mental health, but I don't remember anybody I worked with ever being prescribed ketamine. But I do remember back in my college days, some of my, more rave going or club going friends would occasionally talk about it.
Yeah, so ketamine is generally speaking used as a sedative. It can be used for pain control. It can be used for agitation, as in the case of Elijah. And it's got a lot of really unique benefits relative to some of the other common sedatives that would be given, like benzodiazepines, in that it's pretty short acting. So the time that it takes for it to wear off is much lower than some of the other medicines that are commonly given. And it doesn't include, as a rule, respiratory depression, which is something that's really common if you were to give high amounts of like an opiate or a benzo for pain or agitation. You can decrease somebody's respiratory drive or just depress the respiratory system generally, and cause a lot of really significant problems and overdose them fairly easily. The other thing about ketamine that's nice is that it's got a really high dosage range or wide dosage range. So for ketamine, you can give as a weight-based drug significantly more without risk of overdosing someone, whereas the ranges based on weights for opiates and benzos are much smaller.
Right. So, all that's really important, and it made sense as to why then it would be picked to react in these situations. Now, when it's given on the side of the road, it's given, I guess you said IM, so as an injection?
Correct. Yeah. I mean, you can give it IV. I don't. So full disclosure, as when I was working in EMS, my company didn't have the protocol that involved using ketamine. We used Versed and Ativan, both of which are benzos. So you can give it IV. I don't know if any EMS protocols use ketamine IV. So generally, it's being given IM in the muscle, and that means you're drawing it up into a syringe and then injecting it directly into the person. And the range again is still much wider, even under those circumstances, than it would be for like a benzo or an opiate, and is generally given, as far as I know, for EMTs. And what I was reading about the Colorado case, is generally given for agitation and for pain control, which is nice. Most like a benzo you wouldn't generally give to someone explicitly for pain control, but ketamine has a dissociative effect that makes the person not care about what's going on, which is nice for like emergency situations where someone's really injured in some sort of traumatic event. You'll hear about people that use ketamine illicitly. They refer to it as like the K-hole. Someone becomes dissociated, they get glassy-eyed and staring off into space. That state is really nice for someone who just got really injured in some sort of motor vehicle accident or something, and it doesn't make it difficult to give someone, like if someone needs to be intubated to get an emergent airway. Ketamine can be used for that alongside benzos, and that's, I mean, it's a very versatile medicine, I guess, is really ultimately what I'm trying to say.
Right. One thing I did notice just reading some articles is, and I'm a libertarian, so I don't see the FDA as, the gold standard or anything like that. But I did notice that the FDA has actually not approved ketamine for this use. And it's, I guess, just used as an anesthetic or as a pain relief, according to the FDA. So I don't know if you have anything to mention about that, but I thought it was worth saying just because, these are the agents of the state who are using it in this way. I guess not all the time with the EMS, EMTs, there's some private companies there, but at least with the police, and at least in the case of Minneapolis, they, directed this use. So I don't know, I'll let you say what you want on that.
Yeah. So as far as like off-brand uses for any medicine, like we were talking before we went on, I was in the pre-hospital setting and now work as an ER nurse. So like we would give a medicine like Benadryl or Haldol, both of which are not meant to help someone sleep, to get them to take maybe the edge off and let them sleep in the ER. So I don't know if the FDA approves those meds for that reason explicitly, and I don't know how that all works, regulation wise, but I do know that it's used, and it's understood commonly that it can be used for agitation, and I don't think that there's a great, a lot of these drugs that are abused illicitly become unnecessarily politicized with the classifications for scoring and stuff, as you well know. Like, we all kind of are aware with like the marijuana classification and the problems that it causes for like medical studies and stuff. So it very well may be the case that ketamine is just a difficult drug to study and hasn't been studied extensively in like the universities and stuff because of the way that it's classified. I don't really know.
Right. Well, and ketamine itself provides an example there, because I don't think, or only recently got FDA approval to treat depression. And I guess just anecdotally, I've been around cases where ketamine has been effective with people who have like major depressive issues. That doses of ketamine, spaced out over time, were very helpful in, people who are suicidal. So, but at least until recently, that wasn't something that was even FDA approved. And so that's just because it's not effective. So anyways, one word you used there came up a lot as I was reading. And if you're not in the medical field, I don't think you know what this is, but what is the pre-hospital setting?
Yeah, so the pre-hospital setting just simply means that like when you call 911 and someone shows up, the first responders before they get you to the hospital are considered pre-hospital. It's a pretty wide range, and various communities. It could involve different people, but between fire, EMS, and police. In some rural communities, police are actually medical first responders as well. They'll do a lot of like they can be involved in like administering meds. I know that there's some departments that even have police officers that are EMT certified. Uh, just broadly speaking, it's just everything that happens for a patient in a medical environment before they're transported to a hospital for a higher level of care. And
Right.
just as a quick aside, it necessarily then means that like the goals of care for someone in the pre-hospital setting is very different than it is for like me in the nursing setting in the ER. You're not managing a patient long term. You're not interested in long term effects for the drug. I mean, you have to be aware of them, but like something like ketamine, just to keep it on topic, because it's got such a short time that it's effective for sedation. It's perfect for an ambulance that comes to your house, gives you the medicine, and then 15 minutes later, when you're arriving to the hospital, it is already starting to wear off. Whereas like a benzo, you could have somebody out for hours because of it.
Okay. Well, so here's the interesting thing, though, is that, we've said all this about ketamine. And I did want to say, because, I think it's important just to like look at the science behind it. But we do have this, case, and I found at least a few others where it happens where, again, Elijah McClain is, attempted to be, arrested or, confronted by the police for doing nothing in the first place anyways, and ends up in a chokehold and then given ketamine and then later going into cardiac arrest and dying. And so, I guess as a former EMT, as a police or as now, an ER nurse, and having that medical background, and also, understanding that sometimes, and I know this too, that there are people who act irrationally and aggressively, and, there has to be, I guess, some way to, stop them from destroying property and harming people. And at the same time, they're not necessarily going to be able to consent to, hey, like, I need a dose of ketamine to cool myself down now. That's just not going to happen. And so we have, I don't know, a really complicated situation, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah. So psychiatric issues, like emergent medical treatment of psychiatric issues, and how I interface with it as a libertarian has always been like kind of a pet issue of mine, because I think that there are some really critical state imposed gaps for psychiatric care that's terrible. And I think it has a ton of really terrible outcomes for people who get stuck in the system and then ground up by the fact that they really don't get a ton of access to care, even if they seek it. But in cases like this, and I've personally responded to probably a half dozen or so excited delirium calls as an EMT, and then have dealt with the presentation in the ER several times. In the ER, we don't use that term, and so it seems to me to be kind of like an EMS explicit term. I don't know. You had said that it's not a formal psychiatric coded diagnosis, which I'm not surprised by. But really, what it means is that someone who's in who's having delirium, who's disassociated, meaning that like they're not relating to the environment around them or themselves in an effective way or an appropriate way. And with excited delirium specifically, from what training I had gotten on it when I was still on the ambulance, is that you have two unique manifestations physically. One is acute tachycardia. Their heart rate is high, which if you can imagine can be extremely dangerous in these situations where you're now interacting with or maybe even fighting with police. And you may very well have other drugs on board that make your heart rate go up too. That's a lot of stress for the heart, even for someone young. And then hyperthermia, someone's temperature skyrockets with excited delirium, generally speaking. And my understanding of excited delirium is that it's generally one of two broad categories that kind of can overlap but don't have to. One is withdrawal from or the use of various psychiatric meds, generally ones that affect dopamine uptake or dopamine production, and then crack cocaine use, or I was made to understand too, but I couldn't find any evidence when we were talking about this about like PCP and meds like that. So if someone is on a dopamine affecting psychiatric medicine and or using crack cocaine, that person can be at risk, and it's extremely rare, but can have this manifestation of excited delirium, where they're found, acting extremely strangely. Someone calls 911 because there's someone naked in the middle of a road, or found in people's random houses or in their yards, heard screaming from neighbors. All of these things can happen, and these people are not rational. They're not someone that you can talk to and try to reorient to their surroundings, and can often lash out violently, physically, and not as to say that like they're violent necessarily as people, but in that state where they're unable to like get themselves into a normal state of mind, they can act in really difficult, challenging ways, which poses really significant challenges for EMTs who are showing up on scene, and cops who are really not well versed in psychiatric issues at all whatsoever. And when I had first read Elijah, the meme was going around about his last words. And when I had read it, my very first thought was, I wonder if maybe he was having some sort of like delirium or acute psychotic episode, maybe excited delirium. I don't think I've seen anything that says that they were arguing he was having excited delirium. Usually, in his case, he was just found walking. He wasn't doing anything inappropriate. They were able to talk to him at least for some period of time. That doesn't really jive with my experience and knowledge of excited delirium. That person is not just like taking a stroll down the sidewalk, but it's very possible he was having some delirium symptoms, and was having some sort of like acute psychotic episode. I don't know, and I don't want to disparage him or his case. I know that there's a lot unknown about him still. I don't want to minimize the potential criminality of the way that it was handled by the people who were responding. It struck me that he was seeming like really manic in that quote that was circulating.
Okay. So I guess we should talk a little bit more about excited delirium, and what actually that is. And I guess it's somewhat controversial. I found some articles from Radley Balco in the Washington Post, and something posted on Slate and Salon from back in the day, the Bush years when those sites were a little bit better, talking about how, hey, look, like there's some questions on how this is actually like diagnosed. I guess it isn't recognized as a condition by the APA, the AMA, the World Health Organization, or it also doesn't appear in the new DSM-5. And so it's apparently recognized mostly by like forensic or like mortician, and the way I've read, at least it's diagnosed as, like a cause of death is when they rule out other natural causes. And so there has at least been in the past, and this dates back to the 1980s, I guess, in Miami, where they've misdiagnosed, the cause of death as excited delirium when it was in fact some kind of murder. I'm not saying that's necessarily what happened in this case or anything, but I was just interested on your thoughts on excited delirium. I personally have experience, I don't think necessarily with cases of excited delirium, but definitely people who have like long-standing severe schizophrenia, having like acute psychotic breaks, and, doing things that are completely irrational. And, also to sympathize with the situation of the EMTs and the police officers. A lot of times these psychotic breaks involve, saying very nasty things, using like very either racialized or sexualized language, typically not wearing the appropriate clothing, whether it's, way too much clothing or not enough. And then, their presentation is often very tense. And at times, that they've, smeared their own, feces on themselves and stuff like that. And so, it's definitely not a position that anybody in the world wants to be in, to try to, take somebody who's potentially going to harm themselves or someone else, who's in this psychotic state, and bring them to a state where, they could get the help they need, to then once again act in a safe way for everyone, including themselves.
Yeah, it's an extremely challenging thing, to the point about it being misdiagnosed or conveniently used after a patient's death or a person in custody's death. I don't doubt that at all. It's kind of fits the perfect bill. And I read that Balco piece because, I think these sorts of situations with first responders and policing, with psychiatric issues, there's a lot of subjection on the part of the responders to take this person who very well may be having like acute mania. I don't know if you've ever seen anybody or know anybody knows anybody listening that's had an acute manic episode, but it can be extremely bizarre. People get euphoric. They talk quickly. They often don't sleep for days on end. They're often irrational, difficult to get to accept. Like, we use the term accepting boundaries. So like, not touching, not walking in like an aggressive manner towards staff, not walking into other patients' rooms or into people's living rooms, basic stuff like that. That just mania on its own can cause. And that's something that you can have with bipolar. You can have just simple manic, a manic diagnosis where you just have mania. So point being is that it's a really complicated thing, and that it's not, no one in the field setting is qualified to be making distinct diagnoses about the person's condition. So they're using really broad terms. Even in the ER, I'm using really broad brushstrokes when I'm trying to talk about a patient's symptoms for their next level of care. And it can certainly be hard to respond to these calls and to keep the person safe when they're actively harming themselves or someone else. And so I have a lot of sympathy for sort of every party involved. But as I said before, acute psych issues are something I care a lot about, because I think people in the field are generally fairly callous about it. And I'm obviously speaking with broad generalizations. There are a lot of people who are good about this, but it's frustrating. It can be wearing, and dealing with someone who's irrational or manic, or like you said, saying some really inappropriate things or in really inappropriate situations, and who's also got like this potential for violence, or just really increasing the tension of the moment. A lot of responders don't really want to deal with these people in a patient way, and sometimes it's a lot easier to medicate than it is to try to coax them into it. Now, in an excited delirium situation, the parameters for EMS to consider someone to be in that state is that they have the hyperthermia and are often found naked or in less clothes than would be appropriate for the weather. I told you before we got on, I had a patient who had it, who was found in the snow in just his underwear and was hypothermic because of how long he was in the snow, and is not having, they're irrational. Somebody that whoever called found them have these symptoms come on quickly, all of a sudden, acutely, not like a chronic issue or gradually. And then they're usually not compliant with the plan. So this kind of leads into how we as EMS get someone to the hospital in an acute psychiatric episode. In my state, they're called PEERS, but police emergency evaluation requests. But ultimately, I imagine it works in more or less the same way in every state. Police arrive on scene. They find someone who they think is a threat to themselves or others. They write a piece of paper that mandates that they go to the hospital and be seen by a clinician. And it doesn't have to be a psychiatric clinician, just a medical doctor. And that gives the EMTs the ability to legally transport them without kidnapping them and without needing their consent. And in cases where someone is suicidal, let's say, and doesn't want to go to the hospital, that covers the EMTs. And in cases like acute psychotic episodes, let's say, or excited delirium, these pieces of paper are necessary, but they're often abused in the psych system. And most of the people that are on PEERS, from my experience, and I've seen thousands of patients put on PEERS in the time that I've done EMS in the last 8 years, or emergency medicine in general. It's a absolutely abused system, and it's used for the convenience of police officers sometimes, and gets people in situations where they're upset, acting maybe more volatile than they normally would be because they're being forced to go to the hospital against their will. And it poses a lot of really tough questions for libertarians, but ultimately it's a challenging environment to kind of like try to operate in.
So on like excited delirium, I'm just wondering, I think in mental health in general, and this is something that I've experienced, and this is in no way to discredit any of my coworkers or former coworkers or anything, but whenever you're talking about somebody's mental health and what their diagnosis is, you're going, like, if you have a team of like 5 people working with somebody, you're going to get like 2 or 3 different answers. You'll have people who think, it's more like it's a depression issue, or it's a schizophrenia issue, it's an abuse issue, it's more of an autism issue. Like, there's just so many different things, and so mental health is really difficult. And like, to actually try to pin down and to say that this person has depression and this person has an alcohol abuse problem, and trying to figure out like where to draw the line between the two, or if it's just a little bit of mixture of both. But it is important as to like how you would go about treating it. And is it do they need to focus more on AA, or do they need to get like on the right prescription medications? Do they need an individual therapist? So there's all these things. So if, like, let's say 10 police officers saw somebody acting, how, like, would they all say, oh, this is excited delirium? Or when it wasn't, they would all be able to identify that it wasn't? Or because my sense is that there's quite a few police officers who would be in the situation where you ask somebody to do something twice and they don't respond, or they don't answer your question, or say something that doesn't make sense to the officer. They're pretty quick, throw up their hands and go, oh, it's hopeless, this guy's nuts, we gotta get the EMTs out here. And then on the other hand, you probably have people like yourself who are fairly experienced, and like this is an issue that you think about and care about, and so you may be like more likely to see it as something else, or to maybe be a little bit more patient, and then not have to use a ketamine substance as quickly.
Yeah, so I think excited delirium particularly is not something where you're gonna poll the 10 people who showed up on scene and they're all going to have wildly different answers. If in fact it is excited delirium, these people are an extremely unique presentation. And it's not going to be a matter of them just being like a little bit resistant to care and cops not wanting to deal with it. But there certainly are times where patients are made into psych transfers to the hospital that aren't psychiatric patients. That happens every day across the country, way more than it should because they are difficult, or because they make a statement of wanting to kill themselves so they don't have to go to jail, all sorts of things like that. So, trying to navigate acute psych issues can be really tough. It's, from my personal experience, and this is all anecdotal, really, it's pretty rare to be sedating patients in the field for acute psych. If it's happening, it requires that there's a paramedic that's there giving the medicine. And a lot of ambulances don't have paramedics on them. The majority of ambulances are what's called BLS, or 2 EMTs that don't give sedatives or most medicines. And it requires that the paramedic then has the medical judgment to say this person is so agitated that there's no way we're going to be able to safely get them onto the stretcher, restrained in the back of the ambulance, and to the hospital without them hurting me or themselves. So generally, that's not the case, even for patients who are having acute psychotic episodes. They're usually able to, be moved or coaxed into the ambulance and get to the hospital safely. It's a really tough thing. And the angle about like drug abuse and how that plays into excited delirium and also just acute psych in general complicates everything, because now someone's intoxicated. They may be acting irrationally relative to even how they would when they're just sober. And it frustrates everybody that's showing up there, because everybody kind of has their guard up about, oh, this is like just some drug abuser and not somebody who needs legitimate care. And I think that that's a big barrier in the acute psych sphere generally.
Right. So I do want to highlight, at least, obviously, you're talking about your personal experiences here, so I don't want to discredit those, but I had Will Porter on the show in the past to talk about this case, specifically in Minneapolis, where EMTs, I guess, were resistant to give ketamine, and police officers instructed them to, and they did it anyways. And there was later a study done, I guess, of using ketamine for excited delirium around the time this was happening. And it turned out that a huge number, like I think over half of people in one, like, I guess, round of the study, they found had to be intubated because of the ketamine, or after using the ketamine. So I guess, the cause and effect there could be kind of blurry. So, at least in that case, it seems like there was an abusive situation. There was a case, I believe this was in South Carolina, or it could have been Florida. I forget which one. I think this is the Florida one, where this guy, Willard Truckenmeyer, ends up, he's a vet. He has some TBI he sustained from a roadside bomb. I believe it was in Iraq, or actually I think it was Afghanistan, 2007 it said. And so he ends up, injured, and he's at a bar. He gets drunk one night, and according to reports from a firefighter on scene, he was actually, sitting, up and was handcuffed, and then they gave him a dose of ketamine, and it ended up, he went to cardiac arrest and later declared brain dead. And then you had this case in South Carolina. The guy's name is James C. Britt. He was a 50-year-old man. He was a large stature guy, 6'3", 300 pounds, found with THC in his system. This case, I think the problem was that the cops laid on him for 15 minutes, and then they dosed him with ketamine, and then they laid on him for another 4. And so it seems like maybe the combination of ketamine while using some kind of chokehold or, crushing physical restraint may be a problem. And so, I think that's one of the reasons why I really want to have you on to talk about this today, is because I don't think if I went and just asked some people around where I live, like, hey, are you aware that cops dose people with ketamine, or not cops, or EMTs dose people with ketamine on the side of the road? I think a lot of them would be surprised to hear that. And as far as I could tell from the research I've done, there really don't seem to be any national standards on this. I've been able to find statewide standards, as for my state of Massachusetts, where they, say that in an extreme behavioral situation, you could use it. But the definition is kind of vague, and somebody could interpret it fairly liberally, and I think other people may not do so. So I think there definitely needs to be a real conversation on who we're doing this for, and what are the actual ways to respond to somebody who's going through a situation where a lot of these people weren't necessarily acting violent. They say acting aggressively, but it's not like they were doing anything actually other than when, police put hands on them that was a technical, violation of the NAP. These aren't people who are, out there like trying to hurt people. They probably cleared out a bar. They're swearing. Maybe they're like got their like shoulders, their fists in clenches, and if you're a big guy, that could be very threatening to some people. But at the same time, these certainly aren't people that their behavior, they deserve to die. And I think if the cops just shot him, if a cop has shot Elijah McClain, I think it would have been identified much earlier as something that shouldn't have happened. And so I'll let you jump in on that.
Yeah. So about like cops directing patient care, as a rule, that's not the way it should go. And if I'm a libertarian, right? So if I show up and a cop is asking us to do something, I don't care. And I'm probably far more resistive than the average EMT non-ideologue. But legally speaking, cops don't get to make any medical determinations for patients. Now, can they or do they make comments about wanting to have a patient sedated? I'm sure. And there very well may be a large cross section of people giving these meds that are doing so because they feel pressured by the cops, and I'm sympathetic.
Well, and as you pointed out earlier, like cops act as EMTs in some cases, so
yeah, they wouldn't be giving sedatives though.
In no case would that happen.
I don't know about any police department where they're also paramedics.
Okay.
Because just an EMT basic as the national reg level can't give sedatives.
So what's the difference there? Just clarify that a little bit.
Yeah, sure. EMTB is a basic. They give like oxygen, glucose. They can take vital signs, stuff like that. And they have a lower level assessment. And then a paramedic, they have to go to school for a year or so, and they can give a whole host of meds from like cardiac respiratory support meds all the way up to sedatives for trauma or psych issues or to intubate someone. So they have advanced.
This is why I need to have you on the show, because I had no idea. Yeah. There you go.
Yeah. So yeah, it's a complicated thing, and in the case of Truckenmeyer or Elijah McClain, somebody who's posturing is like a term that I try to use when I'm like charting on a person. If someone's posturing and making physical indications or verbal indications that they want to be physically violent, I take that as the grounds for getting that person restrained or physically, like crossing the threshold into physically moving that patient if the situation calls for it. Generally, you don't want to cross that threshold of physicality, and that's one of the biggest problems with policing is there's not an appreciation for the fact that in normal human interaction, putting your hands on someone without their consent to get them to do what you want them to do immediately changes the dynamic of the entire interaction. And so in the nursing side, we have a couple security guards and then nurses and techs and stuff who are trying to deal with the situation. So we don't have guns. We don't have, a dozen guys on backup over the radio if need be. So we have to be a lot more cognizant about the way that we deal with these patients. And, I just had an injury myself and a security guard recently with a violent psych patient just last week. So, I mean, it's not uncommon for these sorts of situations to crop up. And it takes, I think, a very deft, experienced understanding of how these situations should go, and some techniques to like try to de-escalate. And none of those things are happening in the pre-hospital setting almost by necessity. You're showing up, you have to get these patients to the hospital. You can't spend hours there because you have to get back into the system to, treat the next 911 or whatever. So sometimes the time constraint alone can cause unnecessary force use. But I don't know. It's a tricky thing. I get to, again, about the police and mandating sedative use, that shouldn't be happening. In the case of Elijah, I don't know enough about his agitation or perceived agitation to say definitively yes or no he should have been sedated. And a lot of it is the individual responder who's putting their name on the whole case to be able to support their arguments. And if someone is agitated and a potential threat to themselves or others, depending on the protocols, it may be as simple as that there was some question of aggression and or posturing or whatever, and they're able to give it. I'm not sure, but it definitely needs an entire reframing. I believe in the way that we deal with acute psych here in the U.S.
Right. Yeah. I guess that, really to get to the root of it, whenever you look at the situation, not to, excuse behavior like the Pentagon does by using like the soda straw analogy. But, when you look at the situation of the cop on the ground whose, job it is, according to him and what 90% of the American people believe is, to go interact with this guy, get him pinned down and get him somewhere where somebody else could help him. Like, that's what he believes his job in the system is, because that's what the entire system, minus, the few of us libertarians and other people who, have some pretty radical ideas on policing, tell him that's what his job is. And in fact, if you ask a lot of people in the community what they would like to happen with the crazy people, oh, well, the police will take care of them. And so, that I think is the bigger picture that, puts it in context that, while maybe this police officer in Elijah McClain's case did act, or like the EMT, somebody acted inappropriately by giving him the dose of medicine when they didn't need to. Ultimately, it's the fact that, we task our police officers to enforce all the moral crimes and also keep the crazies in line. And I say that tongue in cheek, not to be mean to people with schizophrenia and who are suffering and stuff. But that's kind of the way a lot of people look at it. And if you give police that job, then they're going to kill some of these people. That's just the way it works. And I think, especially, for my time working with people who have, at times pretty severe psychosis, there's just a level of paranoia about police officers, people who have guns, police officers, a lot of police officers I interact with, the way they approach me, if they approach somebody, with schizophrenia or a mental illness like that, they're immediately going to, perceive the police officer as a threat, and possibly, it plays into like their paranoia or something like that, and just it exacerbates the situation so much. And so, I guess we'll have to have a conversation at a later date, because I think we could get into this about an hour or so, exactly, how to effectively help people with severe mental health, or who are just going through some kind of, acute manic psychotic drug-induced episode, and how the nonviolence principle plays into effect there, because there is real harm that could be done. And as terrible as it is that we just kind of expect our police to keep these people in line, at the same time, there does have to be some kind of system in place to help people who get into these kind of states of mind where they're acting completely irrationally. So I don't know if you have anything on that, but I do want to ask you about Afghanistan before we wrap up.
Yeah, so I do want to just say a couple more things about the case in general. I I am, as I said before, extremely sympathetic to kind of every party involved, because I think it's oftentimes a kind of an untenable, really challenging situation. But I had mentioned to you before, we were trained on our annual in-service training about excited delirium and managing it. And the number one thing that they impressed over and over and over again is that the patients who do have this diagnosis, where they're hyperventilating, their heart rate is really high, and their temperature is high, and they're acting in these ways that we've talked about, the single most important thing that you make sure to do, and that you make sure the police do, is to keep the patient off of their stomach. If a patient is restrained supine, laying face down, which is the standard procedure, generally speaking, for when a cop will bring somebody down to the ground, it's a lot harder to resist when you're face down than it is if you're face up and your hands can go all over the place. That increases the pressure in the patient's thoracic space. It puts them at a lot higher risk for like sudden respiratory failure. And in a case where someone is now being given sedatives, from what I've seen about the studies on ketamine, there's very little evidence about respiratory depression or respiratory involvement, respiratory arrest. But that's not to say, I don't know that they've done any studies about a patient who's having some sort of acute psychotic episode, who's given sedatives, ketamine or otherwise, and then laid on the ground for an extended period of time. So the supine position is one of the singular most dangerous things that can happen to these people. And it's something that needs to be impressed upon every police department nationwide, because rural to metropolitan cops are going to be faced with this inevitably at some point in their careers. And EMS has a duty to their patients and to their well-being, that these people are not laid on their stomachs for long periods of time. Even now, today, I've had patients brought into the ER supine, restrained with police handcuffs or whatever, who are having some psychotic episode or even just intoxicated. And I always pull them aside and make the point, look, they've done a lot of work on this. You have to make sure you don't put these patients supine for extended periods of time, because it very well could be the next Elijah McClain. And these so often, like this story with Kelly Thomas, these schizophrenia patients, they are never treated with the understanding that they should be. And, I just hope that in our lifetimes, we see a drastic change in the way that they're handled. But yeah, let's get to Afghanistan.
Yeah. So, well, the last show I did with Will, we, really talked about what had happened. And I don't think there's anything that's come out in the past couple of days that substantiates, the New York Times claim or completely disputes it. It's just, the mainstream media continues to come up with intelligence leads that, that Trump knew about it and that it's significant. And then the administration and official sources are saying that Trump didn't know about it. And the intelligence around it is dubious anyways. So I guess, just as you spend some time in the country, what do you think about this claim that Russia had some role in, the Taliban killing, I guess, at least one of the 31 Americans that have been killed in Afghanistan over the past 18 months?
So first of all, even if it's true, I think it requires us to ask a lot of really fundamental questions about the conflict that don't seem to be happening while all these people pontificate about it. Namely, why the hell are we still in Afghanistan, allowing the Russians to play proxy war against us? But I think that it's a really I'm as a rule skeptical of whatever the intelligence community comes up with, especially related to major geopolitical issues like the way that we interact with Russia or the Middle East. And so I don't put it past the Russian government to want to do something like this. But if it is the case that the Russians felt that in 2019, 2018, that would be a really good time to start incentivizing the Taliban to fight us, my question would be, why do they need a financial incentive to fight us? They've effectively done so for the last nearly 20 years. It seems odd that now they'd need to be coaxed by the boogeyman Russians to now start killing us. And ultimately, like, we can't forget that in the 80s, we, as the United States government, not we, were training and actively funding the insurgency in Afghanistan, fighting the Russians that killed 15,000 or 20,000 Russian soldiers. In the entire Afghan conflict, we haven't lost more than 5,000 Americans, and there's been no claims that they've been somehow involved with every one of those deaths. This to me feels very much like trying to blame Iran on deaths in Iraq.
Yeah, that seems to be a decent analogy, I guess, other than that the Russians don't have a friendly history with the Pashtun population of Afghanistan anyways.
Right.
And this is actually something I missed to talk about on the last show. I had kind of pointed out that if this was happening, my thoughts were maybe that it's the larger asymmetrical warfare between the U.S. and Russia that, involves sanctions and diplomats and Libya and Syria and all these, and so like I thought maybe the U.S. had killed some Russians in Libya or something, and so now they're trying to kill some Americans, or it was because we were funding Al Qaeda still in Syria, something like that. But just a reminder that it was once the U.S. that was arming and funding this Pashtun minority in Afghanistan against the Soviets. And so, I mean, how horrific of a crime could this have been if the U.S. was just doing it a couple decades ago?
Right. Right. And, it almost requires us to take the next logical question then, that if in a strategic decision, the Russians would believe that incentivizing Taliban to kill American soldiers would somehow help their aims, what exactly do they think that means? Because to me, it says that the likely end goal for a Russian interference in this case would be that they want to keep us in Afghanistan. So if anything, this seems like a great concession for the anti-war or anti-Afghanistan war crowd to say, well, look, obviously the Russians want us to be in Afghanistan. They want us to get bogged down there even more because this quagmire seems to never, have no end in sight. And, our presence in Afghanistan relative to the majority of this conflict is extremely small. So it seems to be that this is a very, very odd time for the Russians to try to be getting involved in this conflict.
Yeah, well, I guess as you are, personally aware of more than most, the Taliban don't need the Russian money to kill Americans. That was the first thing you pointed out. I guess the only thing that maybe would have, caused that to change was the fact that the U.S. had entered into, loose peace negotiations with the Taliban over the past couple of years of the Trump administration that eventually produced a deal. And so maybe, there were some like various, nefarious Russian sources that were out there trying to undermine the deal by having the Taliban directly attack American forces. But, that just goes to further strengthen your point. That is, if the Russians want us to stay so bad, that's a hell of a reason to get out. Because, ultimately, that's what the covert game here is. I guess the other thing I wanted to ask you about, because I thought you may have a little bit more insight to this than I do, but maybe not, which is the assertion is that Trump knew about this sentence March. So even let's say that is true, but that he didn't do anything about it. And I guess just how can we know that that's true? Because if, Trump did something about this, wouldn't that also be like probably a covert response? I don't think he would come out and sanction Russia for this. My guess is that he would try to take out some Russians somewhere in response.
Yeah. So I think it's a ridiculous claim. And first of all, just like on its face, I find the entire argument about like the Russians, that is funding the Taliban to kill Americans, ridiculous. And if it is in fact the case that during peace talks they're trying to complicate matters, it fits very conveniently into the narrative of the Trump campaign and Trump presidency really neatly, that Russia is this unique boogeyman that's influencing American polity and Trump in particular, and now foreign policy goals. And it's just look at another data point on how evil Russian is and how Trump is obviously in Putin's pocket or something. I just find it all very convenient for those that would want to disparage Trump on the grounds that he's some Russian stooge or whatever. It's one of the only positive things about a Trump presidential candidate was his relative relative dovishness towards Russia regarding like the other Republicans or even Hillary Clinton. And so it's very interesting to me. And it seems to me that, there has been a long history of the intelligence community and the deep state or whatever, the permanent state in the foreign policy world, to make sure that the enemies of the United States remain the enemies so that our global military hegemony is secure. And to me, that is my underlying premise whenever I approach these questions, right? Like clearly, between the cui bono for Russia or the U.S. foreign policy establishment, it seems to me that there's a lot more incentive for the foreign policy establishment here domestically to make some claim up about the Russian government to keep us as American voters upset and enraged at this scary people group over in Asia there.
Right. Well, and also make sure that Trump is hemmed in on foreign policy, because it was late last week, I believe I read Jason Ditz writing over at antiwar.com that Trump was working on a plan to reduce U.S. troop levels to 4,500 by the fall in Afghanistan. So cutting the troop numbers again in half. And so I don't know, you're putting on a conspiracy hat for a second. I hear that Trump wants to bring troop numbers down, and suddenly a leak comes out that would, generate the kind of, fervor among, the American media for the U.S. to double down in Afghanistan, and now we can't leave. Well, maybe somebody's trying to, stop Trump from doing that. That's at least one way to read it, and I wouldn't be at all surprised. I mean, that's ultimately what comes out of the Ukraine gate situation, is that everybody comes out and says that, well, actually, the real issue here is that Donald Trump's policy towards Ukraine was insufficiently aggressive towards Russia.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't know. I guess that's probably what's going to happen, but fortunately, the election's in November, so we don't have time for another one of these stupid impeachment trials. But go ahead, finish with whatever you have to say, and wrap up and plug your stuff.
Just to the Russian point one more time, and Trump is the first president since NATO, as far as I know, that talked and campaigned on the idea of getting the U.S. government out of NATO. And so we are able to extend a lot of military power through NATO and a lot of influence with political issues and our allies because of our arrangements in NATO. And so I don't think it's overly conspiratorial considering the history of the way that we got into the Iraq war and how explicit the foreign policy team that was in the public eye was about their interest in making up an excuse for war, or using various aspects of like the intelligence reporting to justify a war. I mean, Wolfowitz out there saying that on Vanity Fair that they chose the WMD issue because it was what they could all agree on. I mean, this is not something that they've been particularly like covert about. So I think that the NATO thing plays into it too. I think Trump is the perfect candidate, or the perfect president rather, to be trying to make these claims and suddenly reignite this Cold War with Russia. And it's terrifying. I mean, it seems as if nobody in the media seems to care that these people have a mountain of nukes just like we do. And it's really terrible and tragic. but yeah, just to plug, I'm at antiwarwarvet.com. My Instagram is antiwarwarvet. You can find me on all the social media sites. I've been working on a rather involved piece right now, but ultimately I'm going to try to get into writing more regularly, hopefully by the end of summer when my ebook is finished, and then hopefully we can get back on and talk about that.
All right, awesome. I'll have to have you back on again soon, and thanks for coming back to the show.
Thanks, Kyle.